emancipation put him in the same category as Dame Nellie Melba and Frank Sinatra, those perennial farewellers who continued to entertain and impress with new work for many years after their fans had bemoaned their retirement. There will be new poems, Anthony. There will be more reviews, more broadcasts, more literary anecdotes, more of the finely judged and immaculate readings that we've enjoyed over the years. Here at Enitharmon, we've been privileged to publish Anthony's poetry for nearly 20 years, taking in his selected poems 1956 to 1996, A Different Country, A Move in the Weather, the monumental collected poems, and in 2010, late poems. And now I remember Anthony making the same valedictory comments about you see, he really can't be trusted at all. What I'd like to say tonight with a captive audience, though, is that in those 20 years we felt very fortunate to have such a significant and accomplished poet as part of the stable, and that professionally and personally we've had tremendous support and encouragement from Anthony and from Anne, for which we're enormously grateful. I know you're all here tonight to pay tribute to Anthony as a poet and as a friend, and to raise a glass to the anniversary couple. But first, for the entertainment, please welcome Anthony Thwaite.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Very graciously said, as usual. I hope I'm going to be able to get through this, and I hope you are too. I think I'm going to read mainly from the book Going Out, and here, for a start, I hope, by the way, I just read something the other day which struck me to the heart. It was some child's definition of poetry, telling a little story in a silly voice. And I thought that was so dreadfully true, whether to cancel the whole of this bloody reading. So I'll start with the first poem in the book. You know Auden, that marvellous W.H. Auden, he used in his later life to show you how long the poem was. It's like this, and it's a sonnet, that is 14 lines rhyming. So it's quite a good idea, because people don't know how long you're going on. That's the thing Larkin used to object to, among other things at poetry readings. How long is the chap going to go on? How long does this poem take? Well, this is quite short. Going Out. Light bulbs, parties, jaunts, the final things. The last most thought about at 84, now, as I gingerly change one of the first. As for the second and third, not much these days, lacking an appetite for either. Drink, a pale dilution, watered wine. No taste for bad behaviour, mad hilarity, or staying up too late. Or fashions either. I never paid attention to such things, not noticing when skirts went up or down, or poets began each line with lowercase. Last orders, ending up, or final things. All titles with a flavour of last words, all leading up to this one, Going Out. When I was trying to find a title for this book, Anne suggested that Going Out was the right title. And the book is dedicated to her for that and for so many reasons. Now, a couple that draw on our experience of a country very much miserably in the news these days, Libya. First of all, history lesson. History lesson. The king went into exile. Little blood was shed. Peace came and smiled at us. New schools were built. Thanks were extended. Fervent prayers were said. No one throughout the land felt any guilt, for none had sinned. And soon there came the day they told us it was we should make the laws, new promulgations, pristine ways to say this was the truth, that was the wicked cause. And then the righteous stood in judgment, doors opened and closed to keep the prisoners in. Gallows went up, the true in heart's just cause wiped out the whole mistaken opposition. And so the land was cleansed as blood was shed. Our leader smiled at us. Prisons were built across the desert while our prayers were said. No one throughout the land felt any guilt, for all the sinful were in jail or dead. And this one is Libya. Thick sand, the Ghibli blowing hard, and the flickering screen bangs back the remembered place, now loud with shots and shouts and running men. And I remember when we fled that place and felt the smell of fear and heard the thud of guns and saw the fire eat up Medusa's timber yard and the collapsed look on Saad's face when we came down the stairs at 3 a.m. and caught the convoy out. And all about the smoke and panic, nothing certain till it all comes round again. But it is now, not then. 1967 shrinks to this flickering screen, is now, and loud with shots and running men and shouts and thick sand blowing, the Ghibli blowing hard. The late Peter Porter, my great dear friend, used to call me in his very precise way a communicating Anglican, which is true. But it is very difficult to believe in all that sometimes. But I have written a credo. Yes, I believe. But what do I believe? Leave out the bits conveniently that stick stiff in my throat and seem much too absurd, or look too much conjurer's bad trick. All those measurements of arks, Noahs and covenants, as if they mattered. Paul laying down the law unyieldingly, or churches filled with soft moans and cheery ditties, like some third-rate American musical. War's chapter of blood-curdling military history, and bleating synods bickering over women. The objections are so many, the stumbling blocks trip me at almost every turn until exhaustion makes me silent. Dare I say, yes, I believe, because despite all that, it's true and trusted, and I hear him speak clear in his mysteries, direct to me. The accusers come to demand his rough judgment. He scratches something in the dust and finds the woman taken in adultery standing there alone, and the accusers crept away, knowing their guilt, knowing their impotence. The gentle riddles of the parables, that last great cry high on the bloody cross, the stone rolled back, and Mary suddenly knowing his voice, and all the voices raised at Pentecost in those alien tongues, appearing, disappearing, going on. The bread and wine, the simple, reached-for things, so difficult to swallow. Yet I believe. Lord, I believe. Help thou my unbelief. And a simpler poem which came to me extremely quickly, and I hope is being set to music even as we speak. Annunciation. Why was he here, filling the room with light, and fear filling her womb? What was he saying under his wings as she was praying? impossible things. Promise of birth, God as the Father, heaven and earth in human feature. What could she say but bow her head as he went away with so much not said? My soul doth magnify, she whispered there. The Lord have mercy in the bright air. Anne and I were in Ripon a few years ago, and I suddenly realised that there was a significance connecting Wilfred Owen and Ripon, that I'd somewhere read that the last few months before he was posted back to France, he was on some sort of training course just outside Ripon, the barracks, but he had a bit of leave in the afternoons, and he managed to rent a place in town where in the afternoons he wrote some of his greatest poems, his few brief hours snatched. So we went to the local tourist office and asked, well, they didn't know a thing about it. Wilfred? Who? So we thought the next best thing was to go to the cathedral. They immediately knew there exactly what we were looking for. And they sent us to Borridge Lane. And some people have been wise enough to put up a little plaque outside this place, which he'd borrowed for only a few months in April 1918. And the poem is called Ripon, April 1918. Under those eaves in Borridge Lane, taking his leave, snatched for a few hours, trying to catch the true tone of what he had known and would go back to soon. Above all, not concerned, stretched out, restored, each considered word. Above all, I am not concerned with poetry, and the blossom like confetti. The poetry is in the pity. I've already mentioned my dear friend Peter Porter. Christine is here tonight, and with her permission, I'm going to read the poem I wrote just after his death in 2000, called Peter Porter. A troubled deist, so you said, with that shrugged grin and tilted head, sharp, self-defining. Now you're dead. Those words come back. You lay exhausted on the bed. On the soundtrack, some stuff you called just music, not your masters Bach and Mozart. What the thing pumped out, not utter rot, yet not front rank. Meanwhile, your room was stifling hot. Your body shrank down to its elements, ready to go, and we all tiptoed to and fro, your breathing heavy, painful, slow. Last week you said, you find me in dire straits, as though poised to be dead. Yet, with a firm, contemptuous snort, you'd told me when I'd asked what sort of sending off you maybe thought would be the best. No humanist funeral. In short, to lay at rest in plain, old-fashioned Anglican ritual, the mortal man was your considered final plan. And now it's done. The reading stopped, the lines all scan, the race is run. I was, as some of you know, evacuated during the war, Second World War, to America between the ages of 10 and 14. And I found some recent poems have come from that experience. This is one. Fernando Lobo. My dark Brazilian friend, 70 years ago in Washington. Both of us were foreign, on the edge of Gordon Junior High. After my English prep school shine wore off, my grades slid down, and I lost interest in most things except stamps and snakes and sex. We visited the embassies, cadging stamps, and messed about off Massachusetts Avenue, playing the hubcap trick on passing cars. You threw one into the road and shouted, "Hubcap!" and the car screeched to a halt. All this was idle, the sort of stuff 13-year-olds get up to. But you somehow made it all different. A different way of foreignness, a mask to wear until a real face appeared. And I went home to England, and the war ended, and I forgot Fernando Lobo. Until last night, I dreamt of your dark smile, conspiratorial and foreign, just like me. I had a curious experience not long ago in Hull. I was up there and doing some sort of larking thing. And a very old man, much older than me, came up and started quoting a long poem of mine to me, like without a text in front of him. And it was a poem which had only a brief airing many years ago and never been properly published. And I resurrected it for this book because I was so impressed by this man quoting the stuff to me. And various people have said, yes, you ought to look at that. It's another reminiscence of my youth, not as far back as Washington, D.C. during the war, but a time just after I was demobbed before I went to Oxford. And it happened to be 1952 that was going on, and I was commissioned by the Ilkley Literary Festival to write some poems for Jubilee Lines, that Jubilee, sort of back then. And this was the result. And I'll try reading them aloud. People seem to be amused with Jubilee Lines. It's a sort of mini autobiography. The day the king died, I was telling Price to pull his socks up or he'd never get his common entrance. Heronwater School, 10 acres of Welsh parkland, healthy air, the boys encouraged to be self-reliant, employed me as a temporary beak, poised for 2 terms between demob and that long-dreamt-of unimaginable life which Oxford promised. Heronwater taught the pre-pubertal boys of prosperous Yorkshire and Lancashire to pass with ease to Oundle, Repton, Rugby, Uppingham, with 1 or 2 to Harrow, and a few, almost unmentionable, who, lacking funds, vanished to grammar schools. I taught them bits of English, history, geography, coached teams in rugger and athletics, took the scouts out in the woods for nature trails, and how to tie a clove hitch, half hitch, wreath and splice. Supervised numbers, euphemistic term for bodily evacuations, front and back, kept carefully for the matron's eyes. Had carnal knowledge of the music mistress, a woman built on megalithic lines. Went drinking in well-speaking pubs with Bill, the classics master, and an unfrocked priest. Discovered R.S. Thomas, whose whole work in 2 slim pamphlets printed locally I bought in Hughes the stationer's in Drill, and wrote verse letters to my army friend Brian, a communist in Chingford. This was 1952, when ration books were still required for sweets, when girls wore sheer nylons with difficult suspenders, and Malaya and Korea took our troops and turned them into corpses. 21, gloomy, ambitious, callow, veteran graduate of the educational corps, messing about with poetry and sex, getting nowhere with either. Did I care when Smythe, the second master, knocked and came into the class where I was chiding Price and said, "The king is dead"? I can't remember. But here the Dead March out of Handel's Saul, the BBC play it hour after hour that day and probably the next day too. Classes were cancelled, I suppose. The head held an assembly in the hall that served as part-time chapel, where his favourite lesson was Sisera and the tent peg. If I'd known that 1/4 of a century afterwards I'd be invited by a festival to write a poem for the Jubilee of the King's daughter, how would I have felt? Impossible to say. The things that happen and go on happening are a vaporous whirl of incidents and nothings, a vague flux soon to be memories or else forgotten, whether a nation's history or the sum total we think of as a human life, a decade or a century, a reign, a period, an epoch or a day. To catalogue the years between, to scan my life or England's, to produce a hymn appropriate as hymns must always be, beyond my powers. I stand here middle-aged, looking on lands I own, with children, wife, accumulations, publications, years of busyness and idleness, and swarms of pleasures and regrets and this and that, alive, half kicking when I want to kick, which isn't often, puzzled sometimes, more lost in a way than that unlined young sprig who told off price for slacking on the day the king died, and the dead march out of Saul thundered across the home and light and third. Dear honorary organiser, this may have some relevance to the 25 years of the Queen's reign, reflect changing patterns, as your kind letter back in February suggested, that the GLC will choose to carve these sentences in slate or stone to be cited on the South Bank, I must doubt. No disrespect for monarchy, or indeed ilkly intended. At another time, say back in 87 or 97, ancestral voices might have brought it off, in pious quatrains, stanzas rich and ripe, confident odes, psalmodic harmonies, but not today. The reasons why must wait for those historians, if such exist, 100 years or so from now. Strange creatures, unforeseeable by us, peering at yellowing archives, holding up for scrutiny our foibles and our fears, these oddities. And one of them may find these rambling, ambling lines and spend all day writing a footnote to establish who the schoolboy Price was, mentioned by one Thwaite, active in the first quarter century of Queen Elizabeth II, now forgotten totally, equally obscure in Ilkley, Nova Zembla, Samarkand. A small voice lost among the drifted years. I think I'll read a couple of poems from a rather early period. We have family members here, children, grandchildren. Here is one written for Alex when he was almost 4. I think he's 19 now. Is that so? How to behave. Alex is almost 4 and knows ways to behave. Being silly is not one of them. He knows his grandpa shouldn't be like this. Kicking my feet up, pulling a face, putting on funny voices. This is being silly. And Alex hates it, wants to tell me so. So he takes his gran off and says to her, "Please let me talk to Grandpa by myself." He tells me what he has to say. I promise. And so I am not silly. I know how to behave, at least in front of Alex. How to behave elsewhere is something I have still to learn. And a rather older grandchildren, summer of 2003. Hearing Jack's saxophone and Will's guitar this June evening, almost the longest day, so that up there a single star dissolves in distant sunlight, there's delay, if only for an instant, of the end I must reach. In this music they suspend my life and lift it up and hold whatever has grown old, and rinse it clean and make it new and clear. And yet their music is as far away almost as that midsummer star to me, however well they play this long light evening, spilling out their free syllables of skill and being young. Some dull thing weighs me down. My tired tongue limps in its utterance, goes dumb. where all the others come, singing and dancing, growing separately. And the last of the earlier poems, this written in Japan in 1990 something.
89.
Oh. This is for the posthumous edition. Together apart. Too much together or too much apart. This is one problem of the human heart. 35 years of sharing day by day. With so much shared, there is no need to say so many things. We know instinctively the common words of our proximity. Not here, you're missed. Now here, I need to get away to make some portion separate in the day. And not belonging here, I feel content when brooding on the portion that is spent. Where everything is strange and yet is known, I sit under the trees and am alone, until there is an emptiness all round, missing your voice, the sweet habitual sound of our own language. I walk back to our room, through the great park's descending evening gloom, and find you there, after these hours apart, not having solved this question of the heart. I think just 3 more poems. This is, well, Pentecost is just over. This is a sort of Pentecostal poem. Just 2 quatrains doing an ordin. It looks like this. 2 quatrains. Tongues. So many words, fragments of language, sounds fractured, diffused, shifted, made obsolete, suppressed, remoulded, or sent underground. Hieratic gestures, chatter in the street. And here, assembled once early that day, when many came, the squandered and the lost, with broken words and whole, to rave and pray, and Babel reconciled in Pentecost. Now this is the last poem in the book, and several people have written me letters of consolement. In fact, I was laughing as I wrote it. It's 3 5-line stanzas called Time to Go. Feeling my age, too soon, too tired, whatever gifts I had no more required, I am a hireling, called in to be fired. Time was, I was ambitious, heretofore. Not anymore, not anymore. Ridding myself of papers, pots, coins, books, no longer vain about what had been looks, the broth boiled over by too many cooks. Time was, I kept some goods held back in store. Not anymore, not anymore. Taking my time over this last short walk, not hearing what I say or how I talk, pushing my knife against my trembling fork. Time was, I knew when I'd become a bore. Not anymore. Funniest poem ever wrote. And I'll finish with my sort of a quick one. Okay, I don't need that. Simple poem. I have to know by heart. Memory's going. Simple poem. I shall make it simple so you understand. Making it simple will make it clear for me. When you have read it, take me by the hand, as children do, loving simplicity. This is the simple poem I have made. Tell me you understand, but when you do, don't ask me in return if I have said all that I meant, or whether it is true.